At 8:17 a.m. Singapore time, the settlement certification stopped moving. Nobody inside the conference room understood why. Not yet. The screens were still active inside the Exchange Operations Center. Trading dashboards remained green. Connectivity tests were passing. The migration timeline still looked stable from the executive slide deck Ryan Mercer presented less than an hour earlier. But the certification queue had frozen. Completely. No approvals. No release authorization. No response from the regulatory coordination channel. I was already gone by then. 3 weeks earlier, Ryan replaced me with his son-in-law during a restructuring call that lasted 11 minutes. 15 years disappeared inside a calendar invite. No warning. No transition authority. No executive review. Just corporate language. Operational realignment. Leadership modernization. Regional efficiency alignment. I listened quietly while Ryan explained that the company needed scalable leadership for the next growth phase across Southeast Asia. Then he introduced Evan Whitmore, 34 years old, consulting background, perfect executive posture. Ryan called him the future of institutional transformation. Nobody asked why the stock exchange leadership suddenly stopped answering internal emails 2 days later. Nobody asked why the ministry liaison stopped attending the weekly coordination reviews. Nobody noticed the procurement office quietly removing 3 scheduled sign-offs from the migration calendar. I noticed, but I no longer worked there. The dangerous part was not technical. That was what Ryan never understood. National exchange infrastructure projects do not survive on software alone. They survive on procedural trust, timing, escalation discipline, quiet political coordination. Half the system existed outside formal documentation. The replacement team inherited architecture diagrams. I carried the relationship map connected to the stock exchange of a Southeast Asian country. At 8:31 a.m., inside the emergency escalation bridge, somebody finally asked the question Ryan had been avoiding for weeks. Who still owns regulatory continuity with the exchange? Silence answered first, then more silence. Evan started speaking about transition documentation. Nobody interrupted him. But nobody looked relieved either, because everybody inside that room already felt the same thing. Something larger had shifted underneath the project. At 8:42 a.m., the first external escalation arrived. Not from the exchange. From a regional banking integration partner. Short message. No greeting. Pending governance clarification, we are temporarily suspending downstream coordination activities until continuity concerns are resolved. That sentence changed the room temperature instantly. Ryan tried controlling the narrative. He blamed temporary stakeholder confusion. He blamed transition timing. He blamed local sensitivity. But Maya Chun was already reviewing the escalation logs. And Maya never reacted emotionally unless the situation was real. She opened the archived continuity tracker I built over 7 years. Then she stopped scrolling. That was the first moment somebody inside the company realized the handover package was incomplete. Not technically incomplete. Institutionally incomplete. At 9:06 a.m., another message arrived. This time from the Exchange Modernization Office itself. The wording was polite. That made it worse. Before we proceed with final settlement certification, we require clarification regarding the removal of the original Regional Continuity Authority attached to the modernization framework. Ryan stared at the screen without speaking. Evan adjusted his cufflinks for the 3rd time in 4 minutes. Nobody inside the room understood why the phrase Regional Continuity Authority suddenly sounded more dangerous than a system failure. I did. Because 15 years earlier, during the first cross-border settlement negotiations, the exchange never approved the company alone. They approved me with it. If you are watching from a city where leadership removed the wrong person before realizing what they actually controlled, leave the city below. At 9:11 a.m., Ryan finally said my name for the first time since firing me. And that was when the real panic started. 3 days after the freeze, Ryan scheduled a regional stabilization briefing from the company's Seattle headquarters. Glass walls, investor-grade furniture, fresh executive messaging. Everything looked expensive enough to calm people who did not understand the danger yet. Evan Whitmore stood near the center display wall presenting recovery metrics to senior leadership across 3 time zones. He sounded confident. Migration status remained operationally stable. Client coordination remained active. No critical infrastructure interruption had occurred. Technically, he was not lying. That was the problem. The collapse was happening inside the spaces executives could not measure. Nobody inside the board review understood why counterparties suddenly became slower, colder, and unusually formal. Response times stretched from minutes into hours, then into days. Regional stakeholders stopped using direct messaging channels entirely. Everything moved into documented communication only. That terrified Maya Chen immediately. Institutions do not formalize communication unless trust has already started collapsing behind the scenes. Ryan ignored her concern during the briefing. He said the exchange was simply adapting to the leadership transition. Then he redirected the discussion toward expansion forecasts tied to the next Southeast Asian modernization phase. Another $40 million pipeline. Another set of government relationships. Another investor narrative. Ryan still believed this was a branding problem. He still thought visibility could replace continuity. At 11:14 p.m. Singapore time, the Exchange Modernization Office sent another procedural request. This one was shorter. Please confirm who now maintains cross-agency continuity authority under the transition framework. Evan answered within 12 minutes. He attached organizational charts, executive authorization letters, compliance certifications, program governance diagrams. The exchange did not reply, because none of those documents answered the real question. I knew exactly what they were asking. For 15 years, every critical escalation moved through invisible sequencing nobody inside the company formally tracked. Regulators trusted certain introductions. Procurement officers trusted certain timing windows. Banking stakeholders required specific diplomatic pacing before approvals advanced. One wrong escalation order could delay months of coordination. None of this existed inside Evan's transition package. Because institutional memory rarely survives executive politics. The dangerous part was psychological. Ryan and Evan still believed silence meant stability. Experienced operators know the opposite is usually true. When institutions stop arguing, they start documenting. And once everything becomes documentation, legal positioning begins quietly underneath the surface. Maya understood that before anyone else. At 6:42 a.m. Seattle time, she requested access to historical continuity records attached to the original modernization agreement. Ryan denied the request immediately. His reasoning sounded polished. No need to revisit legacy dependency structures during active transition management. Maya stopped speaking after that, but she started timestamping every escalation herself. That mattered later. Meanwhile, Evan continued running the project like a consulting engagement instead of a national financial infrastructure migration. He focused on reporting optics, executive visibility, milestone dashboards, transition narratives, but invisible systems were already drifting underneath him. A ministry coordination review disappeared from the calendar entirely. A regional infrastructure vendor delayed invoice acknowledgement for the first time in 9 years. Then the largest downstream banking partner stopped attending synchronization calls altogether. No explanation, no confrontation, just absence. Ryan finally noticed the pressure during a closed executive review with the board liaison committee. For the first time since replacing me, somebody asked him a direct question he could not answer cleanly. Why are external stakeholders behaving like continuity authority disappeared? Ryan blamed cultural sensitivity again. Then he blamed temporary adaptation friction. Then he blamed regional overreaction. Nobody challenged him openly, but nobody looked convinced anymore. At 8:03 p.m., Maya received an internal forwarding error from the governance archive. Attached to it was an old transition memo from 7 years earlier. One sentence was highlighted automatically by the system migration software. Removal of continuity authority without stakeholder stabilization introduces elevated institutional trust exposure across all downstream approvals. Maya read the sentence twice. Then she checked the author field. My name. And less than 20 minutes later, the regional banking partner went completely silent. 6 days after the freeze, the first emergency governance review started without the exchange attending. That had never happened before, not once in 15 years. Ryan still tried framing the situation as temporary communication friction during transition restructuring. Evans supported him with revised integration timelines and updated recovery projections projected across the conference screens. Nobody interrupted either of them. But the room felt different now. People were no longer listening for reassurance. They were listening for inconsistency. Maya Chen noticed it first. The Exchange Modernization Office had stopped using collaborative language entirely. Every message now sounded procedural, cold, legally measured. That shift mattered more than the delayed milestones. Institutions change tone before they change contracts. Ryan did not understand that. At 9:24 a.m., Evan attempted to restart the suspended certification sequence directly through the Exchange regulatory gateway. The request failed within 14 minutes. No technical explanation. No rejection notice. Just a silent routing suspension. Evan looked confused. He kept refreshing the dashboard while speaking about synchronization latency and regional infrastructure congestion. But this was not a systems problem anymore. The Exchange was no longer responding to authority. They were responding to trust collapse. And trust had been tied to continuity, sequencing nobody inside the company formally inherited after my removal. The replacement team finally discovered the first invisible dependency that afternoon. Not software. People. Entire approval pathways depended on informal validation chains built quietly over years between banking regulators, settlement reviewers, procurement ministries, infrastructure auditors, regional modernization advisors. Most of those relationships never appeared inside official documentation because they were not contractual. They were operational. The company had assumed transition authority could be reassigned internally. The Exchange clearly disagreed. At 1:11 p.m., Maya opened archived coordination logs from prior migration phases. Patterns emerged immediately. Critical approvals accelerated only after specific sequencing conversations occurred between certain stakeholders. Risk escalations were often resolved before reaching formal review because I handled them quietly through institutional channels leadership never tracked. Evan inherited the workflows. I had carried the stabilization layer underneath them. That realization started spreading slowly across the governance team. Ryan fought it aggressively. He ordered all communications centralized through executive leadership. He restricted access to historical continuity records. He prohibited further discussion about dependency exposure during board reporting. That decision made the situation worse within hours. Because once institutions sense information control during instability, suspicion expands automatically. At 7:46 p.m. Singapore time, the Exchange Modernization Office finally responded again. The email contained only 3 paragraphs. No hostility. No accusation. That made it far more dangerous. Due to unresolved continuity concerns associated with the recent program leadership transition, we are temporarily pausing final settlement certification activities pending governance clarification. Additional review may be required regarding downstream institutional coordination dependencies. Ryan read the message twice. Then he asked the wrong question. Can legal push back on this? Nobody answered immediately, because everyone in the room understood the Exchange had already moved beyond contract mechanics. This was institutional confidence deterioration. Legal pressure could not repair that. Evan still tried defending the transition. He argued that all technical obligations remained satisfied under the modernization framework. Maya finally interrupted him for the first time since the crisis began. Her voice stayed calm. This does not look technical anymore. Silence followed immediately. Ryan's jaw tightened. Evan stopped moving entirely, because Maya had just said out loud what everyone was quietly starting to fear. The project was no longer drifting operationally. It was drifting politically. At 8:03 p.m., a confidential escalation memo reached the board oversight channel in New York. Priority classification. Potential regional governance exposure tied to continuity disruption during Exchange modernization transition. Attached beneath it was a request nobody expected to see. Board review recommended before any additional executive reassignment authority is exercised. At 6:18 a.m. Washington time, somebody inside the company finally used the word exposure. Not delay, not disruption. Exposure. That changed everything. The emergency review call included Board Oversight Council, Regional Compliance Leadership, Investor Relations, External Governance Advisors. Ryan Mercer joined from Seattle wearing the same controlled executive expression he used during quarterly earnings briefings. But his voice had started slowing down slightly. That was new. The problem was no longer the Exchange freeze itself. The problem was what the freeze might trigger around it. The modernization project tied to the stock exchange of a Southeast Asian country sat inside a larger regional infrastructure initiative connected indirectly to development finance coordination across multiple governments and financial reform programs. Most executives never paid attention to that layer before. Nathan Hale always did. Because institutional projects survive through political sensitivity management long before software matters. At 6:41 a.m., an external governance advisor asked a question Ryan could not answer clearly. Who currently maintains continuity assurance with downstream modernization stakeholders? Ryan immediately redirected toward formal reporting structures. He referenced transition approvals, executive authority, governance alignment, replacement onboarding. The advisor interrupted him halfway through. Ryan lost cadence for the first time during the review. I am not asking who owns the title. I am asking who owns the trust layer. Nobody spoke for nearly 5 seconds. Inside large institutional reviews, 5 seconds feels enormous. Evan finally stepped in. He explained that all operational responsibilities had already transitioned successfully under revised leadership authority. Again, technically accurate. Again, completely disconnected from reality. Because the exchange had already stopped reacting to executive hierarchy. Now they were measuring confidence stability. And confidence was collapsing quietly underneath every interaction. At 8:03 p.m. Singapore time, the next signal arrived. The Ministry Coordination Office postponed a scheduled downstream modernization review indefinitely. No accusation. No hostility. Only procedural language. Ryan tried minimizing it internally. He called it temporary diplomatic caution during stakeholder recalibration. Maya Chen did not respond. She was reviewing archived escalation records from earlier migration phases again. Patterns kept repeating. Every time regional instability appeared over the last decade, Nathan stabilized it before formal escalation reached executive visibility. Not through authority, through timing. That realization was beginning to terrify her. At 9:12 a.m. Seattle time, Investor Relations requested updated exposure estimates tied to the suspended milestone payment structure. That was the first moment finance fully entered the crisis. The number reached the board less than an hour later. $14.1 million. Frozen. Not lost yet, but trapped behind unresolved continuity concerns and institutional review risk. The room dynamics changed instantly after that. Executive patience disappeared. Ryan started pushing harder internally. He ordered accelerated certification recovery. He demanded direct pressure against exchange administrators. He instructed Evan to force faster stakeholder responses through executive escalation authority. That decision damaged the situation further within 24 hours. Because institutional trust cannot be pressured back into existence once confidence breaks, especially across government-linked financial systems. At 11:44 p.m. Singapore time, a quiet message reached Maya from a regional modernization liaison she recognized from older archived reviews. Not an official communication. That mattered. Just one sentence. Does your leadership understand why the original continuity authority mattered? Maya stared at the message for several seconds. Then she opened Nathan's final transition briefing from 3 weeks earlier. Most executives never finished reading it. The final page contained a paragraph highlighted in yellow. Institutional continuity inside sovereign financial modernization projects depends heavily on relationship sequencing stability during leadership transition periods. Forced disruption may trigger non-technical confidence review mechanisms outside contractual recovery timelines. Ryan dismissed that paragraph during the restructuring call. Maya still remembered the moment. At the time, it sounded overly cautious. Now it sounded predictive. At 7:08 a.m. New York time, the Board Oversight Committee requested a closed session review without Ryan Mercer present. And 32 minutes later, the exchange officially froze the $14.1 million milestone authorization. By the second week, the company stopped asking how to restart the migration. Now they were asking how bad the damage could become. That difference spread through headquarters faster than any formal announcement. Conference rooms stayed occupied late into the night. Legal teams joined operational reviews. Investor Relations stopped using optimistic language entirely. Even the executive assistants looked tense. Ryan Mercer still refused to admit the real problem. He kept treating the crisis like an aggressive vendor negotiation instead of institutional confidence collapse. Every meeting sounded the same. We need stronger executive messaging. We need tighter stakeholder alignment. We need faster certification recovery. But pressure only accelerated the drift underneath him. At 8:22 a.m. Singapore time, the exchange canceled another downstream synchronization review without explanation. Then a second banking partner suspended implementation coordination pending governance clarification. Then a third. None of them accused the company publicly. That silence became more dangerous every day. Because once institutions start distancing quietly, they are already protecting themselves legally. Evan Whitmore began losing control during the internal coordination reviews. Small signs first. He repeated numbers twice. He confused approval stages. He referenced outdated milestone calendars that no longer matched external behavior. Nobody corrected him publicly, but people stopped relying on him. That was worse. The replacement team had inherited a system they still thought behaved mechanically. In reality, the entire modernization structure depended on trust choreography built over years between institutions that never fully trusted each other to begin with. Nathan had managed that tension invisibly. Without him, every interaction became slower, colder, more procedural. Maya Chen finally completed the continuity exposure comparison she started 3 nights earlier. The findings were ugly. Over 70% of successful escalation resolutions during the last 9 years involved undocumented sequencing actions tied directly to Nathan Hale. Not technical actions, human coordination actions, timing adjustments, quiet reassurance calls, regulatory pacing, cross-agency clarification, political sensitivity management. None of it existed inside formal operational handover records, because nobody had ever asked Nathan to document trust itself. At 11:07 a.m., Maya submitted the findings to Ryan under internal governance review priority. Ryan rejected the report less than 14 minutes later. Reason stated: analysis relies excessively on personality dependency assumptions unsupported by formal governance structure. Maya read the response once. Then she archived both documents separately. That mattered later. Meanwhile, the board started receiving pressure from outside the company for the first time. Not public pressure. Institutional pressure. Carefully phrased questions. Delayed confirmations. Requests for governance clarification. Concerns about continuity integrity tied to sovereign financial infrastructure modernization. The language remained polite, but experienced executives recognized the pattern immediately. Stakeholders were preparing distance. At 3:44 p.m. New York time, Investor Relations updated projected exposure ranges tied to the frozen milestone structure and delayed regional expansion pipeline. The internal estimate crossed $28 million by evening. Ryan exploded privately during the executive review call. Not publicly, not theatrically. Worse, controlled panic. He blamed weak transition support, regional overreaction, compliance overreach, stakeholder politics. Then he finally blamed me directly. Nathan never documented the system correctly. The room went silent after that. Because for the first time since the crisis began, Ryan accidentally admitted the truth himself. The company had not replaced a manager. They had removed the operational bridge holding together institutional confidence across the entire project. At 8:51 p.m. Singapore time, Maya received another external inquiry. This one carried a restricted governance classification marker. The sender requested a private continuity discussion with the former regional program architect before additional modernization decisions proceeded further. The former regional program architect, not former employee, not former manager. The wording mattered. Maya looked at the request for nearly 20 seconds before forwarding it upward, and less than an hour later, the board demanded to know exactly why Nathan Hale had been removed in the first place. The call came at 11:43 p.m. Seattle time. Not from Ryan Mercer. Not from Human Resources. Not from the board. From Singapore. The number belonged to a regional modernization coordination office connected to the exchange framework. I almost ignored it. Almost. The woman on the line introduced herself carefully. Measured voice. Government-trained pacing. Then she asked a question nobody inside my former company had understood correctly for 2 weeks. Did your leadership explain why continuity authority was changed during active sovereign transition sequencing? Not why I was removed. Why the continuity structure changed. That distinction mattered immediately. I answered honestly. No. They treated it like a staffing decision. Silence followed for several seconds. Then another voice joined the call. Male. Older. Likely ministry-level oversight. He did not sound angry. That made the situation worse. He explained that the modernization project tied to the stock exchange of a Southeast Asian country had never depended solely on contractual performance metrics. Regional financial infrastructure projects required continuity confidence between institutions operating under different political pressures, regulatory standards, and modernization priorities. Your former leadership appears to believe procedural authority transfers automatically through hierarchy. I leaned back in the chair without answering immediately. Because that sentence explained the entire collapse perfectly. The problem was never software. The problem was that Ryan Mercer replaced relationship continuity with executive reporting lines. And institutions noticed faster than his own company did. The ministry official continued speaking. Several downstream stakeholders now viewed the leadership transition as instability risk rather than modernization progression. That perception had started affecting unrelated coordination layers tied to broader regional financial development planning. There it was. The part executives in Seattle never understood. Once sovereign institutions lose confidence in continuity discipline, distrust spreads horizontally across every connected relationship. Not because anyone panics publicly, because everyone quietly starts protecting themselves at the same time. At 12:08 a.m., they finally asked the question Ryan feared most. Did you warn them before the transition? I opened the old document archive sitting inside my apartment office. 47 pages. Final continuity briefing. Submitted 19 days before my removal. I already documented the risk. Another silence. Then paper movement on their side of the call. Somebody was taking notes now. The ministry official asked if the report specifically mentioned downstream institutional trust exposure tied to forced continuity disruption. Page 38. Ryan Mercer entered the executive review room at 8:27 a.m. believing he was still managing a recoverable transition problem. He walked out 93 minutes later understanding the board was now investigating him personally. Nobody raised their voice during the meeting. That was what made it lethal. The board oversight committee had already reviewed the governance packet before Ryan arrived. My continuity briefing. Maya's rejected analysis. Timeline records. Archived escalation warnings. The documents were arranged chronologically across the conference table like evidence in a quiet trial. Ryan immediately shifted into executive defense mode. He argued. The transition remained operationally justified. Modernization leadership required scalability. Dependency concentration around one employee created long-term governance risk. Technically reasonable language. Until the outside governance council asked the question Ryan could no longer avoid. Did you review the full continuity exposure assessment before removing Nathan Hale from active authority? Ryan hesitated. Less than 2 seconds. Enough. Inside board-level reviews. Hesitation becomes documentation. He answered carefully. I reviewed the executive summary. The attorney slid the printed briefing across the table. Page 38 was already marked. Institutional continuity inside sovereign financial modernization projects depends heavily on relationship sequencing stability during leadership transition periods. Forced disruption may trigger non-technical confidence review mechanisms outside contractual recovery timelines. Ryan stopped speaking halfway through the paragraph, because now the wording sounded catastrophic even to him. The board chair finally entered the discussion. Older voice. Measured cadence. Was the replacement decision already finalized before this warning was submitted? Nobody moved. Ryan understood the trap immediately. If he answered no, the timeline records contradicted him. If he answered yes, the board now had evidence the continuity risk was ignored intentionally. He chose the only option executives use when both answers are dangerous. Context evolved rapidly during restructuring evaluation. The board chair stared at him for several seconds without blinking. Then he asked the second question. Did family affiliation influence the appointment process involving Evan Whitmore? Ryan's jaw tightened instantly. Not visibly enough for most people. Enough for Maya Chun. She was seated near the far end of the room, documenting procedural responses for governance record retention. Timestamp. Pause length. Language shift. Everything. Ryan defended Evan aggressively. He emphasized credentials. Consulting background. leadership readiness, transformation experience. But none of those arguments mattered anymore, because the exchange had already answered the real question weeks earlier. Institutions trust continuity, not resumes. At 11:14 a.m. Singapore time, another external escalation arrived. Restricted distribution. The Exchange Modernization Authority formally requested suspension of additional downstream implementation sequencing pending governance stabilization review. That wording hit the board harder than the frozen milestone itself. Governance stabilization review. Now the institution was openly signaling leadership credibility concerns. Not technical concerns. Leadership concerns. Maya watched the emotional shift move across the room in real time. The executives stopped discussing recovery timelines. Now they were discussing containment. At 11:42 a.m., Evan Whitmore was brought into the review unexpectedly. He looked exhausted already. Wrinkled collar, red eyes, tight breathing. The board counsel asked him whether he understood how downstream institutional sequencing operated before assuming transition authority. Evan answered honestly. That was the first intelligent decision he made all week. Not fully. Silence again. Then the board chair asked the question nobody else wanted attached to the official record. Why were we leading a sovereign financial infrastructure modernization project without understanding what our former continuity authority actually controlled? Nobody answered immediately, because everybody inside the room finally understood the same horrifying truth. The company spent 15 years believing Nathan Hale managed a contract tied to the stock exchange of a Southeast Asian country. In reality, he managed institutional confidence itself. At 1:08 p.m. New York time, a secure external line reached the board chair directly. International caller. Priority routing override. The chair listened without interrupting for almost 4 minutes. Then he quietly asked only one question before ending the call. What would stabilization require at this stage? When the line disconnected, he looked directly at Ryan Mercer for the first time since the review began. And Ryan finally understood he was no longer defending a project. He was defending his survival inside the company. The emergency board session started at 6:30 a.m. Seattle time without public notice. No executive assistants. No expanded leadership teams. No investor observers. Only board oversight, governance council, compliance leadership, regional risk advisors. Ryan Mercer arrived 12 minutes late. Nobody acknowledged it. That alone told him the power structure had already shifted. The exchange freeze remained active. The downstream coordination network was still unstable. And now multiple institutional stakeholders were requesting governance clarification before re-engaging with the modernization framework. The company was still operational. Its credibility was not. The board chair opened the session without introductions. He summarized the situation in less than 90 seconds. A politically compromised leadership transition disrupted continuity authority during an active sovereign financial modernization program. The sentence landed harder than any accusation. Because it sounded official already, Ryan attempted one final defense. He argued the organization had become excessively dependent on undocumented operational behavior tied to a single individual. That argument failed immediately. The outside governance council answered before anyone else could. Dependency risk should have been stabilized before transition, not denied after collapse. Ryan looked toward Evan Whitmore instinctively. Wrong decision. Because Evan no longer looked protected. He looked exhausted, cornered, embarrassed. For the first time since receiving the promotion, he seemed to understand the true scale of what he inherited. Not software. Institutional trust architecture. At 7:18 a.m., Maya Chun presented the final governance timeline reconstruction. Every critical warning appeared in sequence. Continuity exposure briefing. Rejected dependency analysis. Suppressed escalation concerns. Stakeholder withdrawal patterns. Exchange stabilization requests. Then she displayed the restructuring approval date beside the continuity warning submission timestamp. 3 days apart. Nobody in the room spoke afterward. They did not need to. The timeline spoke for itself. The board chair finally asked Ryan the question that mattered most. Did you understand the operational significance of continuity authority before removal approval was executed? Ryan answered honestly this time. No. That single word ended his executive future inside the company. Not dramatically, quietly. The board moved into closed deliberation 41 minutes later. Ryan Mercer was formally removed from active leadership authority before noon. Evan Whitmore was reassigned pending governance review and excluded from all exchange-facing activities immediately afterward. No press release followed. No corporate scandal leaked publicly. Because mature institutions rarely explode outward when they fail. They collapse inward first. At 2:14 p.m. Singapore time, the Exchange Modernization Office finally responded again. The message contained one condition for reopening stabilization discussions. Continuity assurance must be re-established through a structure recognized as institutionally credible by all downstream stakeholders. The board understood the meaning immediately. So did I. At 9:07 p.m. Seattle time, the board chair contacted me directly for the first time. No legal language. No executive framing. Just exhaustion. He asked whether I would consider returning temporarily to stabilize stakeholder confidence. I stood beside the apartment window while rain moved across the city lights below. 15 years. Thousands of meetings. Dozens of governments. Hundreds of invisible negotiations nobody inside headquarters ever noticed. Now they finally understood what continuity authority actually meant. Too late. I answered calmly. I can advise transition recovery, but I will not return to the structure that created the collapse. The line stayed silent for several seconds. Then the chair said something no executive inside the company had ever admitted before. We thought we were replacing management. We were removing institutional trust itself. 6 months later, the company still appeared successful from the outside. Quarterly revenue stabilized. The exchange project resumed under revised governance oversight. Investor confidence partially recovered after the board announced internal restructuring measures and enhanced regional continuity controls. Most employees moved on quickly. Corporations are designed to do that. What never fully returned was institutional trust velocity. Everything became slower afterward. Approvals, partnership reviews, cross-border negotiations, government coordination. The company no longer entered modernization discussions tied to the stock exchange of a Southeast Asian country with automatic confidence. Now institutions verified everything twice, sometimes 3 times. Because once continuity discipline fails inside sovereign financial infrastructure work, memory survives longer than contracts. Ryan Mercer disappeared quietly from the industry within months. No scandal, no public destruction, just absence. A consulting role briefly surfaced in a smaller private advisory firm before disappearing again. People inside executive networks understood what happened without needing explanations. He became associated with governance instability. In mature corporate systems, that reputation spread silently. Evan Whitmore stayed with the company temporarily under non-executive transition supervision. The experience changed him permanently. According to Maya Chun, he stopped speaking aggressively in meetings afterward. He started asking operational teams longer questions, listening more carefully, interrupting less. Pain teaches some people what power never could. Maya eventually moved into enterprise governance leadership 2 years later. The board trusted her because she documented reality before the institution was emotionally ready to hear it. That skill becomes valuable after collapse. As for me, I never returned. Not because I hated the company, and not because I wanted revenge. The truth was simpler. Once an institution proves it cannot distinguish between visibility and understanding, rebuilding trust inside that structure becomes nearly impossible, especially after political loyalty overrides operational continuity. 3 months after the crisis, I accepted an advisory position with another international infrastructure group focused on settlement modernization and financial resilience planning connected to emerging regional markets. Different organization, different countries. Same invisible systems underneath everything. The work remained familiar. Quiet rooms, government pacing, careful wording, institutional anxiety hidden beneath professional language. Most executives still believe technology carried these projects. It never did. People carried them. Through timing, trust sequencing, continuity judgment, institutional pacing. Not loud people, not charismatic people. The quiet operators sitting between systems, between departments, between institutions, the ones absorbing instability before anybody else notices it exists. Those people rarely appear inside executive presentations. Until they disappear. Then everybody suddenly understands the architecture was human all along. A year after the freeze, I received a short message from the former board chair. No subject line, Just one sentence. We finally understand why the exchange trusted you more than the company. I read the message once before closing the laptop. Outside my office window, another city was starting another morning somewhere across the Pacific. Another modernization project. Another set of institutions. Another room full of executives studying dashboards while invisible systems moved quietly underneath them. That pattern never changes. Because the most dangerous failures inside large organizations rarely begin with technical collapse. They begin the moment leadership stops understanding who is actually holding the structure together. And by the time reality becomes visible, the damage has usually already started.